So we might get started. So thanks for joining with us today. So this is our webinar on mastering cognitive verbs in VCE Biology. It'll be presented by Helen Silvester. Okay, just before we start, we would like to do an acknowledgement of country. So we would like to recognise the diverse traditional lands on which we are each located. We acknowledge the traditional owners of these lands, and we pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, recognising the elders past, present and emerging. Okay, so introducing our presenter today, we have Helen Silvester here. Helen is a long-time author of ours that has written the VCE Biology series. She's written Oxford Science, Insight Science, and has contributed on a lot of our material. So Helen, would you like to give a little introduction of yourself and your background?
Hi, Gabby, and hi, everyone. So I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people on the lands on which I'm situated today, and their elders past, present and emerging. But I've been working in education for too long for me to remember. Other than writing for Oxford, I've also moderated VCE exams for South Africa, for example. I've reviewed biology exams for 13 years. And been involved in the classroom and now out of the classroom for quite a long time. So welcome everybody.
And just in case you're wondering who I was, my name is Gabrielle Gonzalez. I work here as a science publisher for OUP, and prior to working here as a publisher, I was actually a science teacher working in abilities. Okay, so we'll do a quick overview of today's webinar. So part one, we'll do a quick run through the sort of assessment things to look out for in the VCE Biology study design that's been implemented since this year. Then part two, Helen will give a discussion on the use of cognitive verbs in internal and external assessment and their significance in VCE Biology. And part three, we'll go through some of the pain points faced when teaching VCE Biology and how Biology for VCE Units 1 to 4 is working to address some of these pain points. And then part four, we have a question and answer session. Okay, so part one, how are students assessed in VCE Biology Units 1 to 4? So the new study design does feature some things to look out for when you're thinking about assessment in VCE Biology. So first of all, we've got new key knowledge content which students will be assessed on. And since the first publication of the new study design, there have also been updates and clarifications made by VCA to the extent to which students need to understand the content. So for example, if you've had a look at the frequently asked questions, there's been more clarity on things like the depth to which students need to understand content, such as attenuation and the trip operon, PAM in relation to CRISPR-Cas9, and a lot more. Okay. We've also got a greater emphasis and integration of the cross-study specifications, including key science skills, the new scientific investigation methodologies, and sustainability concepts. So there is now that expectation that students will be able to apply understanding of these cross-study specifications to content knowledge. So it wouldn't be unusual for a student to have to provide an ethical assessment of a concept covered in the key knowledge. So something like selective breeding or GMOs or stem cells, anything like that. And of course, there is that evaluation of a bioethical issue in outcome 3 of Unit 2. Okay, and then regarding changes to assessment structure, so you do have the Unit 1 area of study 3 student designed or adapted investigation, and then building on from that, in Unit 4 you have your area of study 3 scientific poster. And remember that that scientific poster is now only 600 words. You also have the mandated SAC types across Units 3 and 4, and you have a greater variation of SAC types in Units 1 and 2. And of course, a really key change from the study design is that now SACs contribute 50% towards the study score, with the other 50% coming from the external exam. So we have a greater focus on internal assessment, which comes from the school and comes from you. So yeah. Okay, so that was just a really quick look at some of the things to consider with assessment in VCE Biology. But if you did want to have a deeper look at the study design and the requirements for assessments, I would really encourage you to have a look at our Preparing for the New VCE Biology Study Design webinar that we ran last year. So in this webinar, Helen broke down the study design in really great detail. So you can access that using the QR code shown on the screen. Alternatively, you can search Preparing for the New VCE Biology Study Design on YouTube, which should also come up. move on to part 2 of our webinar. Helen, if you'd like to take away.
Thanks, Gabby. So when thinking about what to do in this webinar, one of the things I wanted to discuss is something that I've noticed over the last couple of years. The key terms that they use in the exam questions has actually been changing over time. Now, this came to my attention when I was involved with NAPLAN back in 2018. So the NAPLAN science questions, the way they were structuring the questions was something that was brought to my attention. And since then, I've seen this spread across Australia. So it became really obvious in Queensland, first of all, about 3 years ago. New South Wales brought it in probably about 18 months ago. And just this year, VCAR has published a series of key terms or command terms that they're going to be using in exams. And we'll put that link up for you shortly. But I thought I'd do a breakdown across how exam questions has changed over time. And the big ones you really notice is the early questions from previous study designs had a lot of whats and whys and whiches, predicts, all of those sorts of terms. And you can see from 2016, 2017, 2018, that's when you saw a lot of those terms. The other one that's worth noticing is that explain has gone from 8 questions with explain in them in 2016 through to only 4 more recently, because VCAR is starting to use terms that are more specific, which means we need to make students aware of the difference between these terms. So I've highlighted some of the ones that are becoming a little bit more specific about what they want. And what's really important for this one is also a lot of these questions can be multi-mark questions. And we all know how difficult it is for a student to get the full marks. It's not unusual for a student to get 1 mark out of 3 because they're not including enough detail. And often that's not understanding what the key command term is actually meaning. So I'm going to go through just a couple of them so that you can use some of these ideas, or even perhaps encourage students to watch the video just so that they become aware of the difference in these command terms. These cognitive verbs are the terms used by other states. Command terms is what's used by Victoria. So having an understanding of what's meant by the terms means they'll get better marks. And this is the time of year where students should be doing practice exams. I know we're all panicking trying to finish the content, but it's also worthwhile bringing these command terms to their attention. So I noticed that these terms are also in the practice exam, not a lot of them. They did have a lot of whats and whys, but remember the practice exam was the unrefined version of it. And my expectation is that when we get to the actual exam in October, November this year, that we will see more of the analyse, the explains, the identifies, the justifies, which are the large multi-mark questions rather than single questions. So even the practice exams had these command terms in them. So one of the key ones, one of the easiest ones to have is to outline or summarise. So outline or summarise means to break it down to the key features that students need to do. So I've given, and I was looking at how we can do it, and we need to make sure that anything I show on this video includes things we've got permission to show from VCAR. So that's why I've taken the ones from the textbook. So for example, one of the ones from 2020 was name one cell and outline how it eliminates virally infected cells. So this is an example where you have to name it, but how you have also you need to outline. Now, outline means just the key terms. And to do this, students need to break it down into what's important and make sure they include all of them. And that's where you can see something like this is only worth 2 marks because 1 is for the naming and 1 is for outlining how it works. So the how in there is really important. So not just what it does, but how it does it. So worthwhile getting students to do things like underline or highlight those key terms and therefore work out what's the difference between them. So describe is a little bit more difficult. So describe means to provide the characteristics and key features. So those characteristics and key features means you need to identify what's your start point and what's your end point. Often students will miss the actual full marks because they've forgotten to include that end point of a process. So if you're describing something, then you need to make sure students have that start point, finish point, and then at least one step in between. So you need to write a sequence. So when I'm encouraging students to do this, I tell them to write what the starting point is, what the finishing point at the bottom of the number of lines that they have, and then put at least 1 or 2 steps in between. And that's really important, so not to forget each of those. So the types of things that you might have would be, for example, describe the process of relative dating. So that means describe what happens. What's the first thing that happens, second thing that happens, third thing that happens. Okay, so another one then is explain. So knowing the difference of what's involved in explain, and that's usually related to cause and effect, or the explain why or explain how something happens. So if you need to explain how something happens, sometimes you're explaining the process. To explain why something happens means to give the actual reasons, cause and effect. So students need to identify what's needed. So key thing for them is sometimes you encourage them to jot down all the information and then to be able to put it in order of what's important and then link the data back, because explain means that cause and effect. So you don't just describe what's happening, but explaining the relevance to the actual question. And that's often where they lose that final mark in a multiple example one. And for example, trying to read it here because I can't quite read it, explain how something happens in this question here. Now, this is one of the things that for me was really important for these parts of the books. Each chapter, we've got samples of how to answer and what's a good answer and what's a bad answer. And that's actually really important for students to be able to identify what's the difference between good answers and bad answers. But also on the other half of it, we have another question where students, we give a typical student answer and students actually have to award the marks. Now, I found this really effective when I was teaching students just before the exam, is you give them a chance to write down an answer, but get them a chance to mark someone else's. So to look for how marks are awarded. And that makes a huge difference to students' abilities to get that high-end mark so that they get full marks for a question. So justify is one of those tricky ones. So students often don't know what justify is like, and this is one of the things I know I put in the Oxford Science to start teaching students this ability, but it means they need to support an argument or a conclusion, and often when you ask students to justify, they say, well, it's just because it is, and they don't know how to do it. So the key steps they can use for this is outline the key data from the stem of the question. So tell them not to take up too much room because they're not supposed to just repeat the data, but then make links from that data to the question that they've answered. So usually they have to say what has happened, and then they need to justify how they've made that decision. So what they need to do is, well, from the stem of the question, this, and this is important, and that happens in the solution I've given, and then they give the actual solution. So students need to break it down into those 3 steps. So it's not just this is the answer. They need to be able to say, well, this is the answer because it is linked to this, this, and this in the stem of the question. And that's how they'll get full marks of it. So key things from that is make sure students know how to justify. And that's something we don't always teach very well in science. So make sure you give the chance for students to be specific in the way you teach them this. It really does make a big difference in their final marks. Now, analyze is something, again, we haven't used a terrible lot in the sciences. It does appear sometimes in the humanities. So it means to identify the components, so the key components and the relationship between them. So it's a bit like giving in the previous one, it's a bit like a justify, but it's a bit more specific, and it's not saying you're justifying a particular answer. So what are you trying to analyse? What's the reason that they give? And that's usually in the stem of the question. Then they've got to identify the key data that is related to that. Then they've got to describe the patterns or relationships they see from it, and then why it is important. So there's multiple steps in analysing, and this is something you might expect, for example, for a one of the article questions that have been popular in the exam since 2018. So if they're given a bit of information to read and they need to analyse the effectiveness of something, then they need to, well, what am I needing to analyse and why? What's the key data? What's the patterns in it? And then why it's important that it was analysed. Is there a decision or an outcome as a result of that? So watch for these key terms. They're really important. So this is when I get to hand you back to Gabby really briefly, and then if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat line, because this is something that I think we will need to teach students specifically, just to make sure they maximise their marks. We all know when they know their information, but they've got to get it on paper, otherwise they don't get the marks. Thanks, Gabby. You're on mute, Gabby.
My bad. Okay. Yep. So we'll move on to part 3 of the webinar. So what are some of the pain points experienced teaching VCE biology, and how can biology for VCE units 1 to 4 help? Okay, so 3 main pain points that we've identified that can occur teaching VCE bio is that there are the new standards for authentic stacks unique to each school. So there is more variation across the types of stacks that you can implement in units 1 and 2, and you do have those mandated stack types. So it can be difficult to design some of these stack types from scratch and to make sure that they're up to standard with VCAR's requirements. We also have exam preparation. So this always stresses out students, and teachers want to make sure that they've got enough resources and support materials to help their students revise in the lead up to exams. And number 3, we have the emphasis on data analysis and key science skills. So data analysis can be difficult for students to pick up, and students really need to consistently practice key science skills to be able to recognise how and when they can actually apply them. So biology classrooms also often have students with varying levels of exposure to science. So some might have done a lot of science in the lead up to taking bio, and others not so much. So there's always going to be that variation in how practiced a student is at using key science skills or analysing data. Okay, so how can biology for VCE units 1 to 4 help? So there are new standards for authentic stacks. To help with that pain point, we do have practiced stacks across the unit 1 to 4 textbooks. So our stacks do provide teachers with guidance for how they could design their own stacks. It also gives students the opportunity to prepare for internal assessment, and it gives them the chance to actually practice the different sorts of skill sets that they need to try and apply to different types of stacks. Okay, and then there's exam preparation. So we have a few features to try and help with exam prep. So our exam essentials sections, they provide students with exam tips and step-by-step guidance on how to best respond to VCAR exam-style questions. These sections do provide annotated examples of successful and unsuccessful responses. We also have video tutorials that accompany this section, where our 2 authors, Anna and Helen, will talk through how they would approach a particular question and talk through the different sorts of skills needed to respond to different questions. And we have things like an examiner sections, which encourage students to mark a response using marking criteria from past paper questions. So then they can get really familiar with what sort of things to include or not include in their exam responses and how they're being assessed in the external exam. Okay, we also have lots of practice exam questions throughout the book. So there's multiple opportunities for students to prepare with practice exam questions. These are included at the end of each unit, so in unit reviews. Then we do a cumulative combined unit set of practice exam questions as well. And the way that we structure our questions in our chapter reviews are also based around the exam style of multiple choice short answer questions with mark allocation. And we also have concept videos that are up to date with the latest VCAR clarifications to aid student revision. So if the student's revising and they see an embedded hotspot video, they click on it and it opens up. Here we can see Helen talking about attenuation in the trip operon, so the different control mechanisms. So it's really good to help have that fresh information to help students with their revision for the exam. Okay, and then we also have luminosity quizzes for every topic in the book and review quizzes for each chapter. And each of these questions are linked to a specific key knowledge dot point. So then if you wanted to look at the assessment report, so the curriculum report from luminosity, you'd actually be able to tell how a student's tracking in a particular area of study or a particular outcome right up to the key knowledge level, so you can see how they're performing. Now we have emphasis on data analysis and key science skills. So in our biology toolkit, we do have a detailed breakdown of the key science skills, and we show students how data can be used and put into their questions, or how to use stimulus material that includes data. We also have video tutorials where Helen and Anna will break down exam questions that use data and show kids how to best incorporate the use of data in responses when it's required. And then we have multiple data and skill-based practice exam questions throughout the textbook. Okay, so that was just a really brief look at some of the features that we include in our Biology for VCE Units 1 to 4 series. I encourage you to have a better look at the series by looking at our guided tour video that we've got here, if you scan the QR code. So you can access that through the code. You can also search it up on YouTube, so Biology for VCE Units 1 to 4 guided tour, and that should take you there as well. So we have some pricing and availability information for our Biology for VCE Units 1 to 4 series. We do currently have a promotion on right now where you can trial a Teacher Over Pro for a whole term for free. So if you are interested in trying this out, please pop your name in the chat, and then our sales team will reach out to you so you can have access to the Over Pro for a whole term. And this is a lovely Victorian sales team, so feel free to reach out to them if you have any questions or thinking about adopting the series, or if you wanted to get in contact to try out the Over Pro series and see what it was like. Okay, and now we have our final section. So we've got part 4, which is the question and answers. So I'll just have a look in the chat and see if we've got any to go. If not, then I'll kickstart the conversation with some questions. Okay, so the first question I'll direct to you, Helen. So should cognitive verbs be used in SACs before exam?
That's an obvious yes. If it's going to appear in the exams, then we need to include it in our SACs. And we've given you 2 links there. I strongly encourage you to click on those links. One is to the VCAR command terms that was released earlier this year, and that to me suggests that that's what they're going to encourage in all exams. The other link is one that I found really useful early on. So it's to a Queensland education site where they break down how students can approach each of the command terms, or in Queensland, they call them cognitive verbs, which is where the term for this one came from. What I quite like is they have posters that relate to some of the key terms used in Victoria, which tell students what to think about before they start the question, what to include in the question, and then what to think about afterwards. So for me, it's really nicely laid out. It's aimed at year 7s to 10. So we're training up students early to think about command terms for when they get into exams. And that decreases, let's be honest, it decreases our workload for year 12 students. So strongly recommend you look at particularly the Victorian ones and start including them in your assessments and SACs. But the Queensland one has nice little toolkits that are worth looking at.
Okay, and then we have another question. So do the different command terms have different marking schemes?
Yes, they do. So things like name or identify are usually only worth 1 mark, whereas those that have the explain or the analyze are worth between 3 and 5 marks sometimes. And this is where we've gone from, let's say 5 years ago, we would have some questions that are worth 3 marks, majority are worth 1 or 2. Whereas if you look in the last couple of years' exams, there's a lot more questions that are worth 3 marks, which means students need to incorporate more detail, which means they need to understand what they're actually being asked. Otherwise, it becomes just an information dump of everything they know, which may or may not include the key things. So it's worthwhile encouraging students to be really fussy about what they put down so that they actually think about what the examiners are looking for, which again is tying back to that section on think like an examiner. One of the most effective things that I used to do with students about this time of year when they do their practice exams, decreased my workload for that matter, was rather than me I'd mark the multiple choice, but get the students to mark each other's short answer questions. Now, it sounds like the students would always accuse me of being lazy when they started this. However, by the end of it, it was really worth it. So I'd get students to fold over the names so they didn't see each other's name, and then they would mark one of the questions and be like an examiner. Think about what the examiners are looking for, try and identify it in some other exam that's not theirs, and they do one question and then fold over that page and pass it on to the next person in the class. So no one marked everyone else's exam, anyone else's exam. They all marked different questions. They couldn't comment on it. But what they really learnt is what examiners are looking for, how marks are awarded, and that is the most powerful thing that I've done to increase students' marks. And it did make a big difference to student marks once I started doing it. Any other questions?
So we've got, what other command terms do you think are likely to appear this year?
Good question, and we don't know because it's like the frequently asked questions coming out and changing as they go. But what I do expect them to be is in that command term list from Victoria, from VCAR. So I do expect them to be in. Students need to know the difference. The key thing for that is understanding like I said before, I'm repeating myself, I know. Understanding that the difference between them. So definitely you're going to get explain, that's always there. You're going to get describe, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get evaluate or analyze in this year, because that's the way the questions seem to be going. So evaluate can have a very different meaning to describe or identify. And especially if you've got students who English is a second language, then they need to understand the difference between those terms. You need to be explicit in teaching it. So I can't predict exactly what's on it, but I would expect analyze or evaluate to be there for the first time.
We have another question from Jessica. So how did you ensure that students thought like an examiner in that activity?
Yeah, so for that one there, it was just the fact that they had to go through. What I found early on was that when students were marking their own work, they knew what they meant, so they weren't actually looking at the words of what they wrote. So marking someone else's and making sure that in the interest of fairness, they're not going to say, oh, you did really lousy on your exam, that they just mark one question and then pass it on. But then it was the discussions that got as a result of that, because they think like an examiner. They were trying to get, particularly if they knew the people in the class, which I tried not to get them to see their names, but they were trying to see, but surely this would get a mark, and that would then get the discussion going across the class of why that would or wouldn't get the mark. And that is a learning exercise. It took me about 2 lessons to get through a whole practice exam. But when you're trying to get students to think about how to answer exam questions and to identify what gives the mark and what doesn't, it's the most powerful thing that I've done in terms of getting those big marks. And it did, as I said before, it made a significant difference the year I started doing that to the year before. big difference in marks for the students, and I continue doing it thereafter. So worthwhile doing.
Okay, and then we've got, have you got any tips? How do you teach students these cognitive verbs?
To break down what steps are involved is the key one. So, for example, I'd give them examples. I'd be explicit up the front of the class and give them 2 questions that almost look the same, but would have the different command terms. So, for example, describe the process of relative dating. So if you have to describe the process of relative dating, that means you've got to describe what actually happens. Whereas in comparison, if you have to evaluate the accuracy of relative dating, that's a completely different question. And the only difference is the describe the process or evaluate the accuracy. So two totally different answers, and the only difference is 2 words in the questions. So from that point of view, if you put them up on the board or put them in front of students on a PowerPoint slide or wherever it is you teach, get students to write down answers to both questions so that they see the difference between them. And once they start doing that, then they'll start being more aware of it. So you could throw them the sheets of from VCAR with all the different command terms. They'll sort of read it and forget it. But as soon as you start getting them writing the different answers, they'll actually understand the difference between them and be more careful in how they answer exam questions.
I'll just check if anyone had any other questions. Please pop them in the chat. If not, I think that's it. So just before you head off, so we do have a VCE chemistry webinar running on Tuesday, the 6th of September. So if you do happen to teach VCE chemistry, or you know a VCE chemistry teacher who's wondering how to plan out their year next year, our webinar is focusing on planning your VCE chemistry course for the new study design. So you can access the registration using the QR code link shown. But if not, thank you for joining with us today, and thank you, Helen, for presenting. We really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for coming on board. I know it's the end of a long day.